You may have a seat. Last month, I went out to Colorado to visit my sister for a few weeks and to throw her a baby shower. She is very, very pregnant, about 7 months when I was there with her first baby. When I arrived in Denver, it had been quite some time since I had seen her last, so when she picked me up from the airport, I think I said something like, "Wow, you are really pregnant." I meant it in a "wow, this is cool, you look beautiful" sort of way, but she clearly did not feel quite as awesome about her body changing. We spent the car ride home talking about how challenging it was for her to have this baby quite literally feeding off of her flesh and blood. We talked about everything that was happening within her body, from complexion changes and hormonal shifts to bone movements and organ rearranging. As she ran through the intimate body-changing details, and I replied with "wow" about 15 times, I realized that even as a woman, there is so much I don't know about pregnancy. And there are simple things I didn't know, like I always assumed that when the baby moved, it would look like he was punching her stomach. But it's more like this undulating wave shifting across her belly as the fluid moves. And did you know that you can see them hiccup? It's so cute. Cavil and I couldn't stop talking about how no one talks about pregnancy in a visceral, honest sort of way. Most of what we know comes from casual mentions of morning sickness and food cravings, or TV show pregnancies where the women get this cute little baby bump but manage not to have cankles or gain weight anywhere else on their bodies. No one gets real about pregnant bodies or about female bodies in general, which I guess is not all that surprising, considering that my introduction to puberty was an American Girl doll book. No one talks about periods or placentas or pelvic floors. We, and by we, I mean the church, have done such a great job sterilizing our body talk over the centuries that we have even managed to demonize our own flesh. Theology doesn't get much more harmful than that. Thanks be to God that our world is shifting, that we are writing new theologies full of grace and truth and body positivity, and that the generation below me can talk about their sex and their sexuality more openly than mine and yours. And thanks be to God that in our story this morning, Jesus doesn't shy away from the flesh and the blood of the thing. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Let that sit there for a moment. Let that word flesh roll around on your tongue. Can you taste it? Strange, discomforting, and oddly refreshing. Jesus knows his words are visceral, offensive even. In fact, earlier in this same conversation, he takes the polite approach and he makes the whole idea of flesh eating slightly more palatable by sticking to more digestible metaphors like, "I am the bread of life." But as soon as the crowd protests, the moment they are bothered by Jesus' claim, he digs his teeth in and he heightens the scandal. As if to say, you think you can't handle that? Let's turn it up a notch. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Jesus even transitions to a more graphic term for eating here. Trogo, which in Greek means to gnaw, to munch, to crunch. It describes a kind of noisy, animalistic eating. Think of a predator having just landed its prey. It is eating with a kind of urgency, a desperation, a deep hunger. It is eating as if your life depends on it, and according to Jesus, it does. After Jesus finishes speaking, the disciples, who are some combination of confused and probably disgusted, turn to each other and say, this teaching is difficult. They don't know what to do with this cannibalistic request, and rather than explain it, Jesus again raises the stakes. Does this offend you? He asks. Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? In other words, if you can't handle this incarnation, how in the world are you going to ingest the resurrection? It might be tempting to chalk all of this flesh eating up to a metaphor, to pivot to the Eucharist and to call it a day. But if we're really paying attention to the story, we know that this would be a cheap read. We can't have a gospel that is so disturbingly physical the entire time, and then the moment it gets weird, decide it's all just an idea. Through all of this body talk, Jesus reminds us that life in Christ is not limited to some metaphorical spiritual transformation, but it's meant to bear forth a real physical transfiguration. A physical transfiguration that is strange and visceral, violent even, and deeply human. Throughout John chapter 6, which we've heard bits and pieces of over these past couple of weeks, Jesus continues to push the point that God's wisdom is not just knowledge to be explained or belief to be proclaimed. It is so much more human, so much more bodily than this. It is a table to be shared, loaves and fishes to be eaten, a relationship to be embodied, life to be ingested. Jesus invites us to crunch down on his bone and to chew on his flesh, to drink his blood, driving home the scandal and the true fleshiness of the incarnation. Whether the flesh of an animal or of a peach, maybe of a fish or tomatoes, each of us is intimately aware of the satisfaction of the juiciness of ingesting life. We know how satisfying it is to eat flesh, to eat life that has been given for our nourishment. And if we really stop to pay attention, to think about it, every day, every meal, we not only participate in, but we relish the cycle of death and resurrection. Every day we chew on the flesh of another being to nourish this body. Life by life, death by death, we grow into fuller life. Indeed, what a strange, visceral, and violent reality this is. And I love that Jesus talks about it. I love that his strange instruction, eat my flesh and drink my blood, pushes the crowd back down to earth, back into the hungry animal of their bodies. Wisdom, peace, it's right here in the flesh and in the blood, Jesus reassures them. So take and eat my life, my light, abide in me. This story about incarnate flesh, about God's literal and intimate drawing near to us, it tells us not how to think, not how to understand, simply how to eat. How to receive the love of Christ, how to lean into this beloved body, how to find healing here and to allow ourselves to be human. In Jesus' flesh and blood, he invites us to see that the physical life is the spiritual life. To taste that the Spirit abides right here in our sweet, salty, sweaty, juicy flesh. According to John's Gospel, nourishing the life of the Spirit is no different and certainly no less important than feeding our physical bodies. For the Word became flesh and lived among us after all. And here in this flesh, we feel and we taste and we take pleasure in God's infinite glory. As the story goes on, Jesus continues to make his love known primarily through flesh and blood and touch. He spreads saliva on the eyelids of a blind man to restore his sight. He washes the disciples' feet. He invites Thomas to put his finger in the wound in his flesh. And the gospel ends with Jesus frying up fish on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, waving his friends over and inviting them to join him, saying, "Come and have breakfast." As simple as that, come and eat with me. The incarnation invites us to come home to ourselves, to understand ourselves as integrated physical, spiritual, sexual, emotional, and political beings, to love and to nourish and to feel safe in this body, and to do all that we can to make sure every human being has opportunity to do the same. If the story of the incarnation does not incite a deep reverence for and enjoyment of this life, of this flesh, then we are telling it all wrong. At the end of this story, if we are not eating together at the biggest table we can build, then we need to take another bite and try again. In another passage we heard this morning, Lady Wisdom invited us to come to her table. It's one of those lovely times when God is appropriately personified as a female, as the mother who knows exactly what it's like to give her flesh to eat and her blood to drink, who with joy and excitement invites us back into our bodies. At last, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, come, turn in here, the table is set. Did you hear me calling? Let me touch you for a while, tired bones, spilt blood, cracked skin, what sweet signs of life you bring. Come, eat of my bread, drink of this wine, it is for you. Eat, drink this flesh, this blood, it is of you. This rolling, breathing, laughing flesh, this blood you bear, this life you carry. Taste and see, beloved, it is so good.